All right, guys, so there's a new Mini ITX case on the market, and this is actually the NZXT H2 Flow, and it is a really small design because if you've seen my videos before, you know I use this spinning platform all the time, and it's not taking up pretty much any real estate on this platform. And I'll go ahead and link this down below because I always get questions on which one I use, so I'll link that below. So the case itself looks really cool. It is a very tall but very small footprint case. And then if we kind of take a look at all the panels here to start, we do have a hybrid side panel. So we've got glass up here, so we'll be able to see our motherboard, our RAM, our CPU cooler, and then we have mesh down here, and our power supply is actually going to sit down here with the fan facing this way, so the PSU fan can get a bunch of fresh air. We've got an NZXT logo down here. The front is completely mesh. Same with the top, same with the back. And then we do have some ventilation in the rear. So our motherboard is going to sit right here. Power supply is going to sit right here. And then all of our monitor cables are actually going to go through right here and plug into the GPU. So it's a really interesting looking case. But looking at it more and kind of planning out the build, I think this is going to be really cool. But I guess we'll have to get to the end of the build to see how the build experience was. Then also maybe test some thermals. But let's go ahead and take off the panels real quick and then take a look at the inside. All right, so we've got the H2 Flow down to the bare chassis pretty much, and all of the panels are toolless removal. Each panel actually just pops off, so it's super easy to disassemble. So let's go ahead and take a look at the front. So this will only support ITX motherboards, and you can see our 4 standoffs right there. We've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. So our motherboard's gonna sit up here. We do have a PCIe 5.0 riser cable here. So this will plug into our motherboard down here, and then you can fit SFX PSUs down here at the bottom. And I believe you can fit SFX Ls, but I'll have to make an editing adjustment just in case that isn't a fact and you can't fit that size. And it looks like we do have a little drive caddy down here for, I think, 2.5 inch drives. You definitely can't fit a 3.5 inch drive, but we have a little caddy for 2.5 drives. And then here's another look at the front and just kind of looking at it and planning some cable routing. 24 pins going to go right here. Looks like all of our cables are going to kind of sneak back here, especially for like the GPU. And then the really interesting one is going to be the EPS cable, because I don't know if that can go back here and then up, or if I'm going to have to loop it in front. We'll have to see. Like I said, this is kind of a show build, so I want my cable management to be clean, because we do have that glass panel right here. So that's going to be really interesting to figure out as we go. Then here is the front, and you can actually fit up to a 280 millimeter AIO, which is what we're going to be using with this build. So that's really cool. Then if you look at the top, it comes with 2 F120Qs, I believe they're called, and these are NZXT fans. So we have 2 fans exhausting air. So it looks like our airflow is going to be coming in through the front and then out through the top. And then our GPU is going to be right here. So that's going to be sucking air inward. And then a lot of that air is probably going to exhaust out the top as well. So we'll basically have 2 140 millimeter intakes. Then we'll have 2 120 millimeter exhaust fans. So looks like there's quite a bit of possibilities with this case. And I didn't mention it earlier, but here's our IO down here. I guess that's really hard to say. We've got an audio port, we've got USB Type-C, 2 USB Type-A, and then the power button. And then taking a look at the rear, so you can see our PCIe slot covers are down here. So the GPU is actually going to sit vertical, and you can fit GPUs with a max length of 331 millimeters. Let me go and straighten this out a little bit. There we go. So you can fit GPUs with a length of 331 millimeters. There is the included PCIe cable right here. Our GPU is going to plug in right here, and then we're going to secure it with these screws down here. So it looks like we can fit up to a 3-slot card, but I'd be really careful with the depth of certain cards. You probably don't want to go too deep as far as big GPUs goes, but I have a kind of a bigger GPU going in this build, so I'll report back once the build is done. But lots of interesting possibilities with this case. We've got all of our IO cables right here, and unfortunately the cables are extremely long. So some of these may be way too long, which is kind of unfortunate to cable manage, but we'll see how that goes once I'm done. I know I've said that like 200 times in this video already. We'll basically just see how everything goes once the build is done. So overall, it's a really interesting looking case, a lot of possibilities. So I think we should just jump into the build, and I'll go over each step of the build and show my cable management process and what I'm throwing in the build and the whole nine. So let's go ahead and let's get into it. Okay, so our motherboard is installed and we've got an Asus ITX board here that looks really nice. We've got a Ryzen 7800 X3D. We've got 32 gigabytes of PNY XLR8 RAM and RIP RAM prices right now. And then we've got a 1 terabyte WD NVMe underneath that Strix heatsink. And I was also able to plug in our riser cable to the motherboard as well. And there is a ton of room to do this because all of my viewers that have done an ITX build, you know that things can get pretty cramped, but the motherboard was super easy to put in. All 4 screws are super easy to get to. And then even putting the riser cable in was super easy. And I did some preliminary cable management with all my IO cables like USB-C, USB-A, front panels right here, and then also HD audio is right here, which I didn't film because it's so deep and it was hard to get a good angle to show me installing it, but that is plugged in right there, and I kind of have it routed underneath the riser cable there, so it's nice and clean. And right now I have them zip tied up, and you can kind of see the lines that they take, but I don't know if this is going to be the final way I do it. You can see they're all bunched up right here, because you do have to remember that a radiator is actually going to sit right here. So I want to make sure I have room for especially our motherboard cable right there, and then any other cables I might need, but I just have to remember that a radiator is going to sit right here. Then also our GPU is going to sit right there, so I don't want these cables to be in the way. So one thing I may do later on is I actually may loop them up and over. So if I do them up and over, I can have them fall within these Velcro strips and then they'll just go to the front. So that may be something I change a bit later, but so far the build is going really smooth, no issues so far. So let's go ahead and move on to the next step and then continue from there. Okay, so I'm at another stopping point with the build because there's a few things I wanted to point out. So we've got the power supply installed and all of the cables hooked up for it. Our 24 pin is coming up right here and then behind this tray right here. And then I've got it zip tied right here with our power supply cables. And you can see it goes in and then it comes back up and then plugs in right here. And one thing I'm gonna have to do is I'm gonna have to flatten this out like this to be able to get the radiator to sit right there. So this may sit against the radiator just a little bit, but I don't think it's gonna cause any issues. We've got our EPS cable hooked up in the top left right here, and this cable's actually longer, so it's actually routed down here. And then it comes up and you can kind of see it right there. I apologize, it's really dark, but it's right there. And there's actually a gap behind the GPU. So if I look from this angle, you can see we have a gap. So I actually have the cable kind of behind here, and it comes up and over, and then it's plugging into the front. So we do have this nice little gap to kind of stash the cable behind it. And then we also have our GPU hooked up, and the cable length was absolutely perfect. I've got it zip tied right there with the 24 pin, like I said earlier, and that's coming down and being plugged into the power supply. And then what else did I get done? I got the accessories for our AIO screwed in. So we've got these 4 screws right here. So these are plugged in, screwed in to the spot where the stock AM5 retention brackets are. So I went ahead and removed those and then installed these for our AIO. And then one thing you probably noticed is I already installed the GPU. So the last thing we have left is the AIO, but I was thinking about it. Our screws to secure the GPU are down here. So in order to get to them, you actually have to go from the front. And if our radiator and fans are installed, it's gonna be really hard to get to those screws down there. So unless you have a stubby screwdriver like this one, this is a snap-on one I have because I used to be a mechanic, so I've got a ton of tools. So this will potentially fit down here to screw them in, but even with the radiator in, it might be a tough time. So I ended up putting the GPU in first, and it was really easy to put in. It's slotted into the riser cable really easily, which is right there. And then I've got the screws securing it down there. So the GPU is in place and actually looks really good. And then we're gonna have that mesh panel right here so it can breathe in a lot of fresh air. And then I also hooked up the top fans. I've got the cable just kind of drooping back there, and then it comes back up, loops here, and then it's plugged in to a chassis fan header right there because there's a CPU fan one right here, and I'm gonna end up using that for the radiator fans. And there's also an AIO pump, which I'll obviously use for the pump. So we've got a ton of stuff done, and we're actually almost finished. And one thing I ended up doing was I ended up leaving the IO cables just like this facing down. I still think about going over right here, but I actually don't think I need to. I think with this, how it is right now, I think I'll have enough room for the radiator. The only problem is going to be the 24 pin. So I believe that's everything I got done. There's always a bunch of stuff I film on camera and then I look at it after, and then I kind of change a few things after I'm done filming because I potentially may see a better way to do it. So we're making a lot of progress. We're almost done. Now we just need to remove this front bracket. We need to mount the fans, the radiator, put it all back in, and then put the pump on the CPU. And then we're pretty much almost ready to start this up. So let's go ahead and get to it. All right, guys, so the build is all done and it looks absolutely incredible. I actually really like the end result. And you can definitely take the build in this case a whole lot of different directions. You can go the RGB route like I did, where we've got these big RGB 140mm fans in the front with this RGB and really large screen on the AIO. And for some reason, there's a background process causing my CPU temp to spike a little bit. But you can go the RGB route, you can go the stealth route. And I think it really depends on where the build is going to end up. Like if you're using this in your main setup, then you might go the RGB route. But if it's out in an entertainment system, then you can go for a blacked out build. Or if I wanted to, I guess I could just turn the screen off on the AIO and then turn the RGB off on the fans, and it would get you the same result. So a lot of different possibilities with this build, but it does look really cool. I think this hybrid side panel was a really cool idea, and I probably should have went with RGB RAM so we can kind of see more of it, but I ended up just using blacked out RAM, which you absolutely cannot see right now. And then we've got a mesh panel down at the bottom, which is pretty good at hiding all of our cables behind it and the power supply. But since it's a mesh panel, our power supply can get a ton of fresh air. But this looks really cool. Then here's a shot of the front, those big 140mm fans. We've got our IO down here, and the power button is lit up with a white ring around it. And then if we take a look at the back panel, you can see our GPU is peeking through. So this looks really cool. And then we'll get a shot of the rear as well. I've got power cable plugged in, so I don't want that to come out. But there is the rear with our motherboard. And then our power supply is right there. And then like I said earlier, our monitor cable is going to come through here and it's going to bend up 90 degrees and plug in to the GPU. So honestly, guys, this is a really cool build and I'm really happy with it. But let's take off the panels and then take a look at the inside. So all of the cable management that I ended up doing during the montage is pretty much what I ended up with during the finished build, because I mentioned multiple times earlier that I might route the IO cables over the top right there, but I ended up leaving them routed downward, and I feel like they blend in with the PSU cables really well and they just work that way, so I ended up just keeping it. The only thing I didn't show during the montage is the AIO pump cables. So the cable actually does not come out of the pump. It comes out of this section of the radiator right here. You can see we kind of have this block right here, and there's a connection between the two radiator tubes. So if I go to this side, you can see this is the harness and it's kind of routed like this and it's plugged into the radiator right there. And then within this harness, there's the 3-pin PWM, or it's not a PWM cable, but the 3-pin fan cable actually plugs into our motherboard right there. And then we also have a SATA plug coming out of this harness, and that's obviously for power. So I have a SATA cable coming out of my power supply, and that's plugged into this harness right here. And there's also a USB cable, so the AIO could communicate with the motherboard and vice versa. So I didn't end up showing this, but I ended up routing it this way, and I feel like it blends in really well with all of the cables right here, because we got some of our IO cables right there. And then one thing I was mentioning quite a bit earlier was our 24-pin cables, about how they're going to rub against the radiator. There's actually a tiny little gap right there. Like, it is the smallest gap, but there actually is a little bit of wiggle room between the 24-pin. And I think I'm kind of showing it right there, but there is a little bit of a gap there. So it is not rubbing against the radiator. I actually had more room than I thought. And then if I was really paranoid, I can kind of form that to be even flatter, but there's no issues on that front. I for sure thought it was going to hit against the radiator, but other than that, everything I showed during the montage is the finished result, and it came out looking really good. We got our power supply down here with the fan facing this way. All of our power cables are pretty much just chilling down here in this bunch and going to their respective parts of the motherboard, and then also the GPU, and then taking a look at the rear and our overall cable management. So this is an ITX case, so it's obviously not going to be perfect because you are very limited on room, but all of our cables are pretty much right here and they're all bunched up pretty nice. And then, like I said earlier, our IO cables are really long, so they're kind of all zip tied down here just towards the bottom. And the main goal with ITX builds, and honestly a lot of bigger cases, is just to make sure that your panels close. And like you saw earlier, all the panels close with no issues. So if the panels close, you are good to go. No one really cares about your cable management. I do, but you don't have to. I am definitely a bit of a nut when it comes to it, but the build looks great. We can see our GPU on this side is sitting right against that mesh panel, so it should get a ton of fresh air. And then we've got two 140 millimeter intake fans, and then we've got two 120 millimeter exhaust fans. So we kind of have positive pressure because we have 280 millimeters of intake, then we have 240 millimeters of exhaust. But once these fans kick on while it's under load, because right now the GPU is not under load, so the fans aren't spinning. But once these start spinning, we actually do have an additional 3 intakes. So technically it's negative pressure, but I mean, I'm just gonna say it's positive pressure because the two, just counting the case fans. So really cool layout, and it's really cool that you can fit that size AIO and the fans on the front and also the top fans in such a small case, because airflow is definitely the biggest concern with ITX builds. But honestly, guys, this looks absolutely fantastic. And it was honestly really easy. I think this might be one of the easiest ITX builds I've ever done, because for those guys that have done an ITX build, you know they can be a pain and you're constantly installing and then removing components because you did it in the wrong order or you forgot to plug in a cable or something. There's always a few things that you have to kind of constantly install and remove because of something going on. But this case was really straightforward. I kind of just had to put on my thinking cap and just think of the proper order to do things, which was I put the motherboard in and then I put the power supply in with all the cables, but I didn't plug the cables in. But then I ended up installing the GPU, which I normally do last, but like I mentioned earlier, the bolts to secure the GPU are down here. And then you can see if the fan and the radiator were installed, I wouldn't be able to get to those screws that are right there unless I had a really stubby screwdriver. So I did the GPU, then I plugged in all the power supply cables, and then I did the radiator and the fans and the pump, hooked up the pump, and then we were pretty much done. So the build was really easy in this case, and honestly a lot of fun. I love small builds like this. They're really challenging and they really make you think on the best way to do things and the best way to manage all of your cables. But I think it looks great, guys. But let's go ahead and let's see how the thermals are with this build in the H2 Flow. So I'm currently running an OCCT benchmark for this 7800X3D in the H2 Flow case, and we've got this 280 millimeter NZXT Kraken AIO. And I've run it for probably about 40 minutes right now, stopping it and starting it probably about 3 times. So really wanted to put it through its paces and see what it can do. But right now we're currently sitting at about 70 degrees Celsius for the CPU, and this is under 100% load, so it is handling temperatures really well, and the fans are spinning quite fast right now, and they're definitely making some noise. I think they're at around 1400 RPM, 1500 RPM, so I probably could turn those down a little bit to make it a little less audible. I don't know how much noise is going to come off on camera, but the CPU temps while under load are absolutely fantastic in this case, and it almost makes me wish I would have gone with like a 9800X3D or a 9950X3D to really see what this can do. But with this 7800X3D, we're sitting about 70 degrees Celsius while under full load with OCCT. And then while gaming, it was in around the mid 60s. So it's performing extremely well. But let's go ahead and move on over to testing the GPU now. Okay, so still using OCCT, we're now doing the 3D standard test, which is the GPU test for this. And I do have all settings on extreme. And once again, I've been running this for quite a while now. And then you can see that we're sitting at around 71. And I think the highest temp I saw was around 73 degrees Celsius. So once again, for this small case, and this is an Asus TUF 5060 Ti, I guess it would be helpful to mention that info, but we've got a 5060 Ti in here. So GPU is running at a fantastic temperature. And then during games, it was around the same. It was around mid 60s to the 70s, to low 70s. So this is a really well-performing ITX case, and I think it's a big part of all the fans in it, all the mesh panels. I think it's really well designed, and in all my tests I've tried so far, it is performing extremely well. But that's going to do it for today's video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think of the build down in the comments. Is there anything I could have done better? And then as far as the video itself, let me know if there's anything I could have done better. I've gotten a few comments saying that I need to do strictly more reviews than showcases, but I really like making my builds look as clean as possible. And that's the funnest part for me, is just the showcasing side. So if you guys would like me to go to just like a review type video, please let me know down in the comments, or any other feedback you have for me, because I constantly want to make my videos better. So let me know down in the comments. Subscribe if you enjoy my content, share it with a friend. I hope you guys all have a good day, and then I'll see y'all in the next video.